The train rattled into Red Hollow on a Tuesday morning, belching smoke across a sky that looked like it hadn't decided whether to rain or just threaten it forever. Mara pressed her forehead against the window, watching the town materialize through streaks of soot and condensation. Wooden buildings that leaned like drunk men, dirt streets rutted deep enough to snap an axle, and people who moved with the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting land that doesn't want you on it. 10 women rode in the last car. 10 mail-order brides who'd answered advertisements promising new lives, fresh starts, and husbands who needed wives more than they needed pride. The other 9 women fussed with their hair, pinched their cheeks for color, adjusted their best dresses until the fabric sat just right. Mara just sat. Her dress was clean but plain, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a verdict she already knew. "Do you think they'll be handsome?" asked Sarah, a tiny blonde thing who couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds soaking wet. She had the kind of face men wrote poems about, all delicate bones and wide eyes. "I think they'll be men," Mara said. "That's about all we can count on." Sarah giggled nervously, but the woman across from Mara, Margaret, thin and severe and clutching a Bible like it was the only thing keeping her upright, gave her a disapproving look. A woman should be grateful for any Christian man willing to provide for her. Mara didn't answer. She'd learned that arguments with women like Margaret never ended. They just circled until everyone was exhausted and nothing had changed. The train lurched to a stop. Through the window, Mara could see them. Maybe 40 men clustered near the platform, hats in hands, boots caked with mud, faces burned dark by sun and wind. They looked hungry. Not for food, but for something else. Something these 10 women were supposed to fill. "Lord have mercy," whispered one of the other brides. The conductor appeared at the end of the car, a thick man with tobacco-stained teeth. "Ladies, welcome to Red Hollow. Your new lives await." He said it like he was reading from a script he didn't believe in. They filed out, one by one, onto a platform that creaked under their weight. The men surged forward, then stopped, held back by a town official who looked like he'd drawn the short straw for this duty. He was tall, reedy, with a mustache that drooped past his chin. "Gentlemen, please," he called out, voice thin against the wind. "We'll conduct this properly. Each lady will step forward, state her name, and you'll have a chance to make your intentions known. First come, first served, but we'll have order about it." Order. Mara almost laughed. There was nothing orderly about this. They were being sold, only nobody was crass enough to say it out loud. Sarah went first. She'd barely finished saying her name before 3 men stepped forward, nearly tripping over each other. She chose the youngest one, a boy who couldn't have been more than 22, and he looked at her like she'd hung the moon personally. Then Margaret, who ended up with a widower twice her age. She nodded primly, like she'd expected nothing better. One by one, the other women were claimed. Quick courtships conducted in 30 seconds. A name, a nod, a handshake that sealed a future. The crowd of men thinned. Some walked away disappointed, shoulders slumped, back to claims and cabins where they'd eat alone for another year. Finally, only Mara remained. She stood there while the official, his name was Pritchard, she'd learned, looked down at his papers like they might have an answer he'd missed. The remaining men, maybe a dozen of them, shifted their weight and studied the ground. "Miss Mara Quinn," Pritchard announced, voice faltering. From Philadelphia." The men looked at her. Really looked. She saw it happen. The same thing that had happened her whole life, that flicker of interest, then the assessment, then the decision. Too big, too plain, too much work for too little reward. One man actually laughed, a sharp bark of sound he tried to cover with a cough. "Anyone?" Pritchard's voice had gone from official to pleading. Silence. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the platform. A younger man, maybe 30, with kind eyes and careful hands, took half a step forward. Mara's breath caught. But then another man, older and thick through the middle, leaned in and whispered something. The younger man's face changed. He stepped back. Mara felt something in her chest crack. Not break. She'd had too much practice at this for it to break. But crack. Another fracture in a foundation that had been failing for years. "Gentlemen," Pritchard tried again, "Miss Quinn has traveled a long way." "Maybe she should have stayed in Philadelphia," someone muttered. A few men chuckled. Heat flooded Mara's face, but she kept her chin up, kept her eyes forward. She'd be damned if she'd give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "This is highly irregular," Pritchard said, shuffling his papers like they were somehow responsible for this mess. "Perhaps if we—" "I'll take her," The voice came from the back, rough as gravel and twice as hard. Every head turned. The crowd parted and he walked through. Tall, maybe 6'3", with shoulders that looked like they'd been carved from the mountain rock itself. His hair was dark, shot through with gray, pulled back and tied at his neck. His face was all hard angles and old scars, a beard covering the lower half, and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore buckskin and fur, carried a rifle like it was part of his arm, and moved with the kind of silence that made you realize how much noise everyone else was making. The men scattered away from him like he was diseased. "Calder," Pritchard breathed, and there was fear in it. Rhett Calder stopped 3 feet from the platform, close enough that Mara could see the weathering on his face, the old pain carved into the creases around his eyes. He looked at her, not the way the other men had, measuring and finding her wanting, but direct, steady, like he was seeing something they'd all missed. "You got a problem with that?" Rhett asked Pritchard. No problem. It's just," Pritchard fumbled with his papers. You haven't been to one of these before." "Didn't need to before." "Of course, the lady has to agree, you understand. It's her choice." Rhett's gaze shifted to Mara. Up close, she could see his eyes weren't cold like she'd first thought. They were careful, controlled, like a man who'd learned to keep everything locked down tight because the alternative was worse. "You looking for a husband?" he asked her. Mara's throat had gone dry. Every instinct screamed at her to be cautious. This man looked like he could snap her in half without trying, and the fear rolling off every other person in Red Hollow told her he had a reputation for a reason. But what was her alternative? Get back on that train to where? Philadelphia, where she'd been a burden to cousins who'd made their resentment clear every single day? Stay in this town where she'd just been publicly rejected by men who'd been desperate enough to send away for wives? "Yes," she said. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. Rhett nodded once. "Then we're settled." He looked at Pritchard. "Papers." Pritchard scrambled to produce a document, hands shaking enough that he nearly dropped it. Rhett signed with quick, sharp strokes, then handed the pen to Mara. She took it, looked down at the paper, a marriage certificate, already filled in except for their signatures, and felt the unreality of it all crash over her. She was about to marry a complete stranger, a dangerous stranger, if the terror radiating from everyone else meant anything. But she'd come here to marry a stranger anyway. At least this one had chosen her. She signed. "Congratulations," Pritchard said weakly. "You're now man and wife in the eyes of—" "Got a horse for her?" Rhett interrupted. What?" "A horse. She'll need one for the trip up the mountain." Pritchard looked like he'd been asked to produce a dragon. "The company doesn't provide—" Rhett pulled out a leather pouch, dropped it on the official's papers. It landed with the heavy clink of coins. "That enough?" Pritchard opened the pouch, eyes widening. "More than enough." "Keep the extra. Get her a decent saddle, too." Rhett turned to Mara. "You ride?" "Not well," Mara admitted. "You'll learn." It wasn't unkind, just factual. "Wait here." He walked off toward the livery stable, leaving Mara standing on the platform while the remaining men and the few townspeople who'd gathered to watch the bride selection stared at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. "Miss Quinn," Pritchard said quietly, leaning in, "are you quite certain about this?" "Calder, there are stories." "What kind of stories?" Pritchard glanced around, lowered his voice further. "He's been up on that mountain 5 years now. Alone. Before that, he had a wife and a little girl. They say—" He stopped himself. "They say what?" "They say he killed them, buried them up there, and never came down to answer for it." The crack in Mara's chest widened. "Do you believe that?" Pritchard shifted uncomfortably. "I believe a man who lives alone on a mountain for 5 years isn't right in the head. I believe you should think very carefully before you go up there with him." Mara looked toward the livery stable, where she could see Rhett talking to the stable master, who kept stepping back every time Rhett moved. "If he wanted to hurt me, wouldn't he have picked someone smaller, someone who couldn't fight back?" Pritchard had no answer for that. 20 minutes later, Rhett returned leading 2 horses, his, a massive gray gelding that looked like it could pull a plow, and hers, a smaller chestnut mare with intelligent eyes and a saddle that, while worn, was solid and well-maintained. "This is Maple," Rhett said, handing Mara the reins. She's steady, won't spook easy. Mara put her hand on the mare's neck. The horse whuffed softly, warm breath against her palm. Hello, Maple. Your bag's on the train? Just one trunk. Rhett nodded to a young boy hovering nearby. Get the lady's trunk. Strap it on the pack horse. He tossed the boy a coin. The boy caught it, eyes huge. Yes, sir, Mr. Calder, sir. He scurried off like he'd been released from a trap. Mara watched all this with growing unreality. An hour ago, she'd been facing humiliation and homelessness. Now she was married to a man she'd spoken maybe 15 words to, about to ride into mountains she couldn't see through the clouds. Rhett mounted his horse in one smooth motion, then looked at her expectantly. Right. She had to get on the horse. Mara put her foot in the stirrup, grabbed the saddle horn, and hauled herself up. It wasn't graceful. She was too heavy for graceful. But she made it. The mare shifted slightly, but stayed calm. You good? Rhett asked. Good enough? He almost smiled. Almost. Just a tiny crack in that stony exterior. Then let's go home. They rode out of Red Hollow with the whole town watching. Mara could feel their stares like brands on her back, could imagine the whispers starting before they'd even cleared the first building. The desperate woman and the dangerous man. A story they'd tell for years, probably, each retelling making Rhett more monstrous and Mara more pathetic. Let them talk. The road, if you could call it that, climbed steadily upward, leaving the town behind. The air changed, grew thinner and colder. Pine trees crowded in on both sides, thick enough that the sunlight came through in scattered pieces. They rode in silence for what felt like hours. Mara's thighs started to ache, then burn, then go numb. She'd ridden exactly 3 times in her life, all of them gentle walks through Philadelphia parks. This was different. The mare had to pick her way over rocks and roots, and Mara had to move with her or get thrown off. Finally, as the sun started its downward slide toward evening, Rhett pulled up beside a small stream. We'll rest here. Water the horses. Mara dismounted, trying not to groan at the protest of muscles that hadn't known they existed until today. She led Maple to the stream, watching the mare drink in long, steady pulls. Rhett filled a canteen, then brought it to Mara. Drink. You're not used to the altitude yet. She drank, and the water was so cold it hurt her teeth. But it was clean, cleaner than anything that came out of taps in Philadelphia. She could taste the mountain in it, stone and snow and something wild. How much further? She asked, handing back the canteen. 3 more hours if we keep steady. He studied her face. You hurting? There didn't seem to be any point in lying. Yes. It'll get worse before it gets better, but you'll toughen up. He said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly. You need to eat something? I'm fine. Rhett pulled something from his saddlebag anyway, tossed it to her, jerky, tough, and salty, and better than it had any right to be. Mara chewed it while Rhett checked the horse's hooves, the pack straps, the rifle that never left his side. Mr. Pritchard told me stories about you, Mara said, surprising herself. Rhett didn't look up from the hoof he was examining. Did he now? He said you killed your wife and daughter. Now Rhett did look up, and his eyes were flat and cold as winter ice. For a long moment he didn't speak, and Mara wondered if she'd just made a fatal mistake. Then he set down the horse's hoof, straightened, and looked at her dead on. I had a wife, he said quietly. Sarah, and a daughter, Emma. She was 4 years old. Fever took them both in the span of 3 days. I buried them on the mountain because Sarah loved it up there, and Emma never got to see enough of anything in her short life. His voice didn't change, stayed level and controlled, but Mara could hear the pain underneath it, old and deep and permanent. I didn't kill them, but I couldn't save them either, and maybe that's the same thing to some people. Mara's chest ached. I'm sorry. You asked. I answered. He turned back to the horses. We should move on. Don't want to be caught on the narrow trail after dark. They rode on. The trail got steeper, rockier, until Mara couldn't believe anyone had ever called it a trail, more like a suggestion of where a path might go if it had ambition. The trees thinned out, replaced by scrub brush and exposed rock. Wind picked up, cutting through her dress like it wasn't there. Rhett glanced back. You cold? I'm fine. He made a sound that might have been skepticism, but he didn't argue. They climbed higher. Mara's hands went numb on the reins. Her face felt like ice. But she didn't complain because what would be the point? They couldn't exactly turn around now. Just when she thought her body might simply give up and slide off the horse from exhaustion, the trail leveled out. They came around a boulder the size of a house, and there it was. A cabin, tucked into a natural shelf of rock. Not some rough-hewn shack thrown together in desperation, but a real structure. Solid walls of thick logs, a stone chimney, windows with actual glass, and a porch that wrapped around the front. Behind it, a lean-to stable and a small outbuilding, probably for storage. And beyond that, the mountain kept climbing, all rock and pine and sky. Home, Rhett said simply. He dismounted and came to help her down. Mara's legs buckled when her feet hit the ground, and Rhett caught her arm, steadying her without comment. She leaned against Maple for a moment, waiting for her legs to remember how to work. "I'll get the horses settled," Rhett said. "Go inside. Fire's banked, but should still be warm. Coffee pot's on the stove if you want it." Mara nodded and made herself walk toward the cabin. Each step was an argument between her body and her will, but she made it up the porch steps and through the door. The interior was not what she'd expected. Clean, for one thing. Organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a proper stove next to it. A table and 2 chairs sat near the window. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies, tools, books, actual books, more than she'd expected a mountain man to own. A narrow ladder led up to a loft where she could see the edge of a bed. One bed. Right. They were married. She was his wife now. Mara made herself move to the stove, found the coffee pot right where Rhett said it would be. The fire in the firebox had died to embers, but there was enough heat to warm the pot. She found a cup, poured herself coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, and wrapped her hands around the warmth. The door opened and Rhett came in, carrying her trunk like it weighed nothing. He set it down near the ladder to the loft. "Your things," he said. "You can put them wherever you like up there. I sleep down here mostly, on the bench by the fire." Mara blinked. We're not. We just met today," Rhett said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "I'm not the kind of man who demands his rights before you've even learned my full name. You'll sleep in the loft. It's warmer up there anyway, heat rises. I'll take the bench. When and if that changes, we'll discuss it, as equals." Something in Mara's chest that had been tight since Philadelphia loosened just slightly. "Thank you." Rhett nodded and moved to the shelves, started pulling down supplies. "You hungry? Real food, not just jerky." "Starving." "Can you cook?" "Yes, not fancy, but I can cook." "Don't need fancy, need food that keeps you alive." He set out flour, salt, some dried venison, a jar of what looked like preserved vegetables. "Everything you need is here. I'll show you where the rest is stored tomorrow. For tonight, make whatever you can with this." It was strange cooking in this unfamiliar kitchen while this unfamiliar man sat at the table cleaning his rifle. But Mara had learned long ago that strange didn't mean bad. She made something halfway between stew and soup, thick with venison and vegetables, seasoned with herbs she found hanging from the rafters. The smell filled the cabin, warm and hearty. They ate in silence, Rhett methodically working through 2 bowls to her 1. When he finished, he sat back and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd entered the cabin. "You did good today," he said. "The write-up isn't easy even for people who grew up on horses. You kept up, didn't complain, made a decent meal at the end of it. That's more than I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who'd cry or argue or demand to go back down." He stood, carried his bowl to the wash basin. "You're tougher than you look." "People usually think I look plenty tough." Rhett paused, then turned to look at her. "People see what they expect to see. Doesn't mean they're right." He dried his hands on a cloth. "I'm going to check the perimeter before full dark. You should get some rest. Tomorrow starts early up here." He left before she could respond, and Mara was alone in the cabin with her thoughts and the slowly dying fire. She climbed the ladder to the loft, opened her trunk, and looked at the few possessions she'd brought. 3 dresses, undergarments, a few books, a silver brush that had been her mother's. Not much to show for 28 years of living. But maybe that was all right. Maybe starting fresh meant traveling light. Mara changed into her nightgown, climbed under the heavy quilts on the bed, and listened to the wind howling outside. She should have been terrified. Should have been questioning every decision that had led her here, to a mountain cabin with a man who might be dangerous, might be kind, might be both. Instead, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something like possibility. Outside, she heard Rhett return, heard him banking the fire, settling in for the night. And Mara closed her eyes and let the exhaustion take her under, into a sleep deeper and more peaceful than any she'd had in the city. Tomorrow she'd learn what it meant to live on this mountain. Tonight she'd rest, and that was enough. Mara woke to darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. For a panicked moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed felt wrong. The air smelled different. Everything was too quiet and too loud at the same time. Then memory crashed back. The mountain. The cabin. Rhett. She was married to a stranger and sleeping in his loft. Below, she heard movement. The scrape of metal on stone. The crackle of kindling catching fire. Through the cracks in the loft floor, firelight flickered to life, painting shifting shadows across the rough-hewn beams above her head. "You awake up there?" Rhett's voice, rough with sleep. "Yes." "Sun's not up yet, but it will be soon. We've got work to do before the weather turns." Mara sat up, her body screaming in protest. Every muscle she owned had filed a formal complaint overnight. Her thighs felt like they'd been beaten with clubs. Her back was a solid knot of pain, and her shoulders had apparently decided to stop speaking to the rest of her body entirely. She made herself stand anyway. Made herself climb down that ladder without whimpering, though it was a near thing. Rhett glanced at her, already dressed and moving with the easy efficiency of a man who'd done this routine 10,000 times. "You're moving like you aged 40 years overnight." "Feels about right." He almost smiled. "Coffee's hot. Drink 2 cups before you do anything else. There's bread in the tin and butter in the cold box outside. Eat, then we'll get started." The cold box turned out to be exactly that. A wooden box built into the shaded north side of the cabin, packed with snow that apparently never melted completely, even in summer. Inside, wrapped in cloth, she found butter, eggs, and what looked like cheese. She brought them in, made herself a breakfast of bread and butter and coffee so strong it could probably strip rust. And by the time she finished, the sky outside had shifted from black to deep blue. Rhett was waiting by the door holding a heavy wool coat. This was Sarah's. Should fit you better than it fit her. She was smaller. Mara took the coat, ran her fingers over the worn fabric. "Are you sure?" "She's not using it." His voice was flat, factual. Not cruel, just honest. "And you'll freeze without it. Up here, pride doesn't keep you warm. Wool does." She put on the coat. It fit well enough, a little tight across the shoulders, but warm. So warm. Rhett handed her a pair of gloves next, then a hat that covered her ears. "First rule of the mountain," he said. "You take care of your body or it quits on you. No second chances up here. You get frostbite, you lose fingers. You get hypothermia, you die. Simple as that." Cheerful thought for breakfast. Not trying to be cheerful, trying to keep you alive. He opened the door and cold air rushed in like an animal. "Come on." Daylight's burning. The world outside was transformed. Frost covered everything, turning the landscape into something from a fairy tale, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Their breath came out in white plumes, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe too deeply. Rhett led her to the lean-to stable where the horses waited, already awake and shifting in their stalls. "This is the first thing you do every morning. Before coffee, before food, before anything else. The animals come first. They keep us alive, so we keep them alive. Understand?" "Yes." "Good. Watch." He showed her how to check each horse for injuries, how to clean their hooves, how much grain and hay to give them. His hands moved with practiced care, gentle despite their size and the scars that marked them. The horses leaned into his touch, trusting. "Your turn," he said, stepping back. Mara tried to copy what she'd seen. Her fingers felt clumsy in the gloves, and she was too slow, too hesitant. But Maple stood patient while Mara fumbled through the process, only huffing softly when Mara took too long with the hoof pick. "Not bad," Rhett said. "You'll get faster. Now the chickens." "Chickens?" He led her to the small outbuilding she'd noticed yesterday. Inside, a dozen hens clucked and fussed on their roosts, feathers fluffed against the cold. The smell hit her immediately, warm and organic, and not entirely pleasant. They need fresh water, feed, and you collect the eggs. In winter, you check them twice a day to make sure the water hasn't frozen. He demonstrated moving through the small coop with surprising gentleness for such a large man. "They don't lay as much in cold weather, but they still produce enough to keep us going." Mara collected eggs while Rhett watched, correcting her when she reached too quickly and startled a hen. "Easy. You're not stealing from them. You're making a trade. You give them food and shelter. They give you eggs. Approach it like theft, and they'll peck you bloody. By the time they finished with the animals, the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, painting everything gold and pink. Mara's hands ached from the cold despite the gloves, and her legs were protesting the work after yesterday's ride. But there was something satisfying about it too, something real. "Now we check the wood supply," Rhett said, leading her to a covered area stacked high with split logs. "We burn through about half a cord a week in deep winter. Have to stay ahead of it or we freeze." "How much do you have?" "Enough for this winter, barely. Come spring, we'll need to cut more for next year. It's a cycle. You're always working for the season after next, never the one you're in." He showed her the root cellar next, a space dug into the hillside and lined with stone. Inside, shelves held jars of preserved vegetables, smoked meat, dried beans, flour in sealed tins, and more supplies than Mara had expected. "You did all this yourself?" she asked. "Took me 3 years to build it up properly. First winter up here, I nearly starved. Didn't know what I was doing, didn't have enough put by." He ran a hand along one of the shelves. "Lost 20 pounds that winter. Learned my lesson. Now I prepare." They spent the morning with Rhett teaching and Mara learning how to read the weather and the way clouds moved across the peaks, how to find the spring that fed their water supply, how to tell if snow was stable or ready to slide. Her head spun with information, but she tried to hold on to all of it, knowing that up here, ignorance could kill you just as surely as cold or hunger. Around midday, they stopped for a meal of bread and cheese and cold venison. They ate standing up, looking out over the valley below. From up here, Red Hollow was invisible, hidden by distance and terrain. They might have been the only two people in the world. "Why did you choose me?" Mara asked, surprising herself with the question. Rhett chewed slowly, swallowed, took a drink from his canteen. "You want the truth or the polite answer?" "Truth. Those men down there, they were looking for ornaments, pretty things to make their cabins less empty. You weren't what they wanted because you looked like you might have opinions, might argue, might expect to be treated like a person instead of property." He glanced at her. "I didn't need an ornament. I needed a partner, someone who could survive up here, and you looked like maybe you could." "That's it? You looked at me and decided I was sturdy enough?" "No. I looked at you and saw someone who'd been told her whole life she wasn't good enough, and who got up every morning anyway. That's the kind of stubborn you need on a mountain." He folded up the cloth that had held his food. "Was I wrong?" Mara thought about it. About all the time she'd been passed over, looked through, dismissed. About the cousins in Philadelphia who'd made her feel like a burden every single day. About standing on that platform in Red Hollow while men laughed at her existence. "No," she said finally. "You weren't wrong." "Then we'll make this work." The afternoon brought new lessons. How to split kindling. How to maintain the various tools. How to set snares for rabbits along the trails. Rhett's teaching style was blunt and practical. He showed her once, made her do it herself, corrected what needed correcting, and moved on. No coddling, but no cruelty either. He expected competence and seemed willing to wait while she developed it. By the time evening came, Mara was so tired she could barely stand. But she made dinner anyway, a thick stew that used the last of the vegetables from the cold box and some dried herbs she was learning to identify. They ate in silence again, but it was becoming a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. After dinner, Rhett pulled out a whetstone and began sharpening various knives and tools. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filled the cabin. Mara cleaned up the meal, then sat at the table with one of the books from the shelf, a worn copy of something about mountain plants. "You read much?" Rhett asked without looking up from his work. "When I can. Never had much time for it in Philadelphia." "Take all the time you want up here. Winter nights are long. Reading helps." They fell quiet again. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin's corners. Inside, the fire crackled and the lantern light flickered, and Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the absence of constant anxiety. No one here was judging her, finding her lacking, wishing she'd take up less space. "I'm going to check the animals one more time before bed," Rhett said, standing and stretching. "You should sleep. Tomorrow we'll start on the real work." "What's the real work?" "Teaching you to shoot." He left before she could respond, and Mara sat there thinking about what that meant. Guns terrified her, the noise, the violence, the permanence of what they could do. But up here, that terror was a luxury she couldn't afford. The days fell into a pattern after that. Wake before dawn, tend the animals, eat, work more, sleep. Rhett was a demanding teacher, but a fair one. When Mara struggled with something, he showed her different approaches until one clicked. When she succeeded, he acknowledged it with a nod and moved on to the next challenge. The shooting lessons were harder than anything else. The rifle was heavy and awkward, the recoil bruised her shoulder, and the noise made her flinch every time. But Rhett was patient in his way, standing behind her and adjusting her stance, her grip, her breathing. "Don't anticipate the shot," he said. "That's what makes you flinch. Just squeeze steady and let it surprise you." It took her 3 days to hit a target consistently. When she finally put 5 shots in a row into the center of the target Rhett had set up, he actually smiled. "Good. Now you do it again, and again, until your body knows it without thinking." So she did. The work was endless and exhausting, but Mara found herself growing stronger. Her hands developed calluses, her arms built muscle from hauling water and splitting wood and carrying supplies. She stopped getting winded on the walk to the spring. Her aim with the rifle improved until she could hit targets at distances that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. And slowly, carefully, she and Rhett began to talk. Not about anything deep at first, just practical things. How to tell if meat had gone bad, why certain trees made better firewood than others, which paths were safe in snow, and which ones could kill you. But gradually, the conversations expanded. One evening, maybe 2 weeks after she'd arrived, Mara asked about the books on the shelves. "Sarah liked to read," Rhett said. "Ordered them special from back east. Most expensive thing we owned besides the horses." He ran a finger along the spines. "She'd read to Emma every night, made up voices for all the characters, did the whole performance." It was the first time he'd volunteered information about them, and Mara held very still, afraid that if she moved wrong, he'd stop. "What was she like?" "Sarah." Rhett was quiet for so long Mara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Small, barely 5 feet tall, couldn't have weighed 90 pounds. But tough, you know? Came up here when I had nothing but a half-built cabin and big ideas. Never complained, not once. She could outwork most men I knew." His voice went softer. "She laughed at everything. Found joy in the smallest things. First snow, wildflowers, the way the light hit the mountains at sunset. I never understood how she did that." "And Emma?" A smile ghosted across his face, there and gone. "Just like her mother. Curious about everything, always asking questions. Why is the sky blue, Papa? Where do the birds go in winter? Why can't I climb to the very top of the mountain?" She was 4 years old and already had opinions about how the world should work. "The fever," Mara started with Emma. Just a cough at first, nothing that seemed serious. Then the fever spiked and wouldn't break. Sarah nursed her day and night, barely slept. By the time Emma started to recover, Sarah had caught it. He stared at the fire. "I couldn't get down the mountain fast enough to bring back a doctor. Storm had closed the passes. By the time I could move again, they were both gone." "That's not your fault." "No. But it's not my fault either. I brought them up here. I chose this life for them. Sarah never would have been on this mountain if not for me." "Did she want to leave?" Rhett looked at her, surprised by the question. "No, she loved it up here. Said it was the freest she'd ever felt." "Then she made her choice too. You didn't force her." He didn't respond to that, just went back to staring at the fire. But something in his shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. After that, he opened up more. Told her about building the cabin, about the first winter when everything that could go wrong did, about learning to live with the mountain instead of against it. And Mara found herself sharing too, about her parents dying when she was young, about the cousins who took her in out of obligation and never let her forget it, about all the small cruelties that came from being the wrong shape in a world that valued thinness above almost everything else. "They used to say I ate too much," she said one night. "Would comment on every bite I took, every second helping, made me feel like I was stealing food right out of their mouths just by existing." Rhett looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You need to eat to work, and you work hard. Food's fuel, nothing more." It was such a simple statement, but something in Mara's chest loosened at hearing it. No judgment, no moral weight attached to something as basic as hunger. 3 weeks in, a storm hit. Not the first snow they'd seen. There had been dustings, light falls that melted by midday, but a real storm, the kind that turned the world white and made the cabin creak under the weight of wind and ice. They were trapped inside for 2 days while the storm raged. Rhett kept the fire going, rationed their supplies carefully, taught Mara card games to pass the time. The close quarters should have been uncomfortable, but somehow they weren't. They developed a rhythm by then, an understanding of each other's spaces and silences. On the second day, Mara woke to find Rhett standing at the window, staring out at the storm with an expression she couldn't read. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Just thinking." He didn't turn around. "You've done well up here. Better than I expected, honestly." "Should I be insulted?" "No. Most people couldn't do what you've done. Learning all this in a few weeks, adapting to the altitude, the work, the isolation, it takes a certain kind of person. Or a certain kind of desperation." Now he did turn, looked at her directly. "Is that what this is for you? Desperation?" Mara considered the question honestly. "At first, maybe, but not anymore. I like it up here. I like waking up and knowing exactly what needs to be done. I like that the work matters, that if I don't do it right, there are real consequences. I like—" She stopped, unsure if she should say the rest. "What?" "I like not being invisible. Down in Red Hollow, in Philadelphia, I was just this embarrassing presence that people wished would go away. Up here, I'm necessary. You need me to help with the work. And that means something." Rhett was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the cabin and sat down across from her at the table. "You're not just necessary, Mara. You're good at this. The animals trust you. You've got steady hands with the rifle, and you remember everything I teach you. That's not desperation. That's competence." It was possibly the longest speech she'd heard from him, and every word of it mattered more than he probably knew. The storm broke on the third day, and they dug themselves out into a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls, burying the windows on the north side. The path to the lean-to was completely gone, and the trees sagged under the weight of white. "This is what winter up here really looks like," Rhett said. "What we've had so far was just practice." They spent the day digging out, checking on the animals, making sure nothing had been damaged. The horses were fine, the chickens had survived in their insulated coop, and the supplies were intact. But it was hard, exhausting work, and by evening, Mara was so tired she could barely lift her arms. She was in the loft, about to change for bed, when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not animals. Voices. Mara climbed down the ladder to find Rhett at the window, rifle in hand, body tense as wire. "What is it?" "People. Coming up the trail." His voice was flat, controlled. "3 of them, maybe 4. This late? In this weather? Nobody comes up here by accident, and nobody comes up here with good intentions." He moved away from the window, started checking weapons. The rifle, a shotgun Mara hadn't seen before, a revolver that went into his belt. "Go back upstairs, stay quiet. Don't come down unless I call for you." "Rhett?" "Now, Mara." The tone left no room for argument. Mara climbed back up to the loft, but she didn't stay away from the edge. She positioned herself where she could see down into the cabin, where she could hear. A knock came at the door, hard, commanding. Rhett waited a moment, then opened it. 3 men stood on the porch, backlit by lanterns that made their faces shadows. But the one in front stepped into the light, and Mara got a good look at him. Tall, well-dressed, despite the weather, with a face that was handsome in a cold, calculated way. The kind of man who'd learned early that his looks could get him what his words couldn't. "Calder," the man said. "Been a while." "Not long enough, Voss." Rhett's voice could have cut glass. "What do you want?" "Just passing through. Thought I'd check in on an old friend." Voss's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Aren't you going to invite us in? It's cold out here." "No." Voss's smile hardened. "That's not very neighborly." "We're not neighbors. You're 15 miles down the mountain, and you came up here in a storm for a reason. State it and leave." The 2 men behind Voss shifted, hands moving toward their coats. Rhett's hand was already on his rifle, and something in his posture made them stop. "I've heard rumors," Voss said, voice pleasant, but with an edge underneath. "Heard you brought yourself a wife up from that bride train. Thought that was interesting, seeing as how you've been alone up here since Sarah died." "My business, not yours." "See, that's where you're wrong, Rhett. Everything on this mountain is my business. This whole valley, from Red Hollow to the high passes, I own it. Or I will, once I finish buying out the holdouts." Voss leaned against the doorframe like he owned it already. "You're sitting on land I want. Have been for 5 years now. I've been patient. Figured the isolation would drive you down eventually. But now you've got a wife? That changes things. I'm not selling. You haven't heard my offer yet. Don't need to, the answer's no. Voss's pleasant expression cracked slightly. You're making a mistake. I've got resources, Calder. I've got men. And I've got legal papers that say this land belongs to me, has belonged to my family since before you ever set foot here. Your papers are forged and you know it. This land's federal territory, open to homesteading. I filed my claim proper 5 years ago. Federal doesn't mean much this far from civilization. Up here might makes right, and I've got more might than you do. From her position in the loft, Mara could see the tension vibrating through Rhett's frame, could see his finger resting on the rifle's trigger guard, not quite touching the trigger, but close. You need to leave, Rhett said quietly. Right now. Voss studied him for a long moment, then stepped back. I'll go. But I'll be back, Calder. And next time, I won't be asking nicely. His eyes scanned the cabin's interior, and Mara shrank back from the edge of the loft, hoping the shadows kept her hidden. You think about my offer. Think about whether that new wife of yours wants to be a widow before she's even properly settled in. He turned and left, his men following. Rhett stood in the doorway until their lantern light disappeared down the trail, until the sound of their horses faded completely. Then he closed the door, barred it, and stood there with his forehead pressed against the wood. You can come down now, he said without turning around. Mara climbed down the ladder. Who was that? Harlan Voss, richest man in the valley, or thinks he is. He's been buying up land for the past 3 years, forcing people out when he can't buy them out. Rhett moved away from the door, started checking the windows. He wants this mountain because there's silver up here, a vein that runs deep and rich. I found it 2 years ago, haven't touched it, because once word gets out, this place stops being mine. But he knows about it. He suspects. Can't prove it, but if he could drive me off, he could search for it himself. File his own claim. Rhett met her eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't know he'd move this fast. Thought I'd have more time before what? Before this became dangerous for you. Mara thought about the men on the porch, about the threat in Voss's voice, about the look in his eyes when he mentioned widows. Something cold settled in her stomach, but alongside it came something else, something hard and angry. I'm not leaving, she said. Mara, I'm not. She moved closer, made sure he was looking at her. You chose me because you thought I was stubborn enough to survive up here. So let me be stubborn. I'm not running from Harlan Voss or anyone else. This is my home now, too. Rhett studied her face, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Something like respect. All right, he said finally. Then we'd better get ready, because he meant what he said. He'll be back, and next time he won't come just to talk. They worked through the night, barely speaking, moving with the kind of grim efficiency that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. Rhett pulled crates from places Mara hadn't known existed, from under floorboards, from behind false panels in the walls, from the rafters. Ammunition, mostly, enough to outfit a small army. He arranged it in strategic locations around the cabin, showed Mara where everything was. If it comes to a fight, we can't let them get inside, he said, checking the load on the shotgun for the 3rd time. Once they breach the door, it's over. We defend from cover, make them pay for every foot of ground. Mara watched him move, this man who'd seemed so quiet and contained just hours ago, now transformed into something else, something dangerous. You've done this before. It wasn't a question, and he didn't pretend it was. Different mountain, different war, but yes, you were a soldier. For a while, long time ago. He set down the shotgun, picked up the rifle, started field stripping it with practiced hands. Thought I'd left that behind when I came up here. Guess you can't ever really leave it behind. Mara thought about the scars on his hands, the way he moved like violence was a language he'd learned fluent and never quite forgotten. Will he really come back? Yes. Men like Voss, they don't bluff. He said he'd return, so he will. Question is when and with how many. How many can we handle? Rhett looked at her, and there was something almost apologetic in his eyes. Depends on how good they are. If they're just hired guns looking for easy money, we might manage 4 or 5. If they're experienced, if they know what they're doing. He didn't finish the sentence. Mara picked up the revolver he'd set aside, felt the weight of it in her hand. She'd fired it exactly twice during her training, both times missing the target completely. Teach me again, everything. I need to know more than I do. So he did. Through the remaining hours of darkness, Rhett drilled her on loading, aiming, breathing. He showed her how to brace for the revolver's kick, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it, how to keep firing even when her hands were shaking and her ears were ringing from the noise. They couldn't risk firing actual shots. The sound would carry, might draw attention. So he used dummy rounds and made her practice the motions until they were automatic. In a fight, you won't have time to think, he said. Your body has to know what to do without your mind getting in the way. Fear makes you stupid. Training makes you survive. I'm already stupid with fear. No, you're not. You're here, aren't you? You could have run when I told you what was coming. You stayed. He adjusted her grip on the revolver. That's not fear, that's courage with the good sense to be scared. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. They'd prepared everything they could, extra ammunition staged, weapons loaded, food and water stored where they could reach it without exposing themselves to fire from outside. Rhett had even rigged the windows with boards he could drop into place quickly, turning the cabin into a fortress. But nothing happened that day, or the next, or the one after that. The waiting was worse than Mara had expected. Every sound made her jump. Every time the wind shifted, she thought she heard horses. At night, she lay awake in the loft, listening to Rhett move restlessly below, knowing he wasn't sleeping either. They kept up the daily routine. The animals still needed tending, firewood still needed splitting, life didn't stop just because danger was coming. But everything had changed. Rhett carried a weapon everywhere now, even to the chicken coop. Mara found herself scanning the tree line constantly, looking for movement, for threats. A week passed. Then 2. The tension stretched like wire pulled too tight. Maybe he changed his mind, Mara said one morning, feeding the chickens while Rhett stood watch nearby. He didn't. How can you be sure? Because men like Voss don't change their minds. They just wait for the right moment. He shifted his rifle to his other shoulder. He's gathering men, making plans. When he comes, he'll come hard. Mara scattered the last of the feed, watched the hens squabble over it. You never told me about the silver, where it is. You don't need to know. If something happens to you, if something happens to me, you get on Maple and you ride down to Red Hollow as fast as you can. You don't look back, you don't try to defend this place alone, you just run. Understand? Mara turned to face him. That's not going to happen. Mara, no. We're past that now. You need to show me where the silver is. Not because I want it, but because I need to understand what we're defending. What's worth dying for? Rhett stared at her for a long moment, jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. Finally, he nodded. All right, come on. He led her away from the cabin, up a narrow trail she hadn't explored before. The path climbed steeply, switching back and forth across the mountain's face, until they reached a spot where the rock face had crumbled away, revealing a dark opening barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. In there, Rhett said. About 30 feet back, the tunnel opens up. That's where the vein runs. I found it by accident, was looking for a place to store ice and found this instead. Mara peered into the darkness. Have you mined any of it? No. Once you start pulling silver out, you leave traces. Tailings, disturbed ground, changes in the rock. People notice. And once they notice, they start asking questions. He turned away from the opening, looked out over the valley below. I thought about it, especially that first winter when I had nothing. Could have made myself rich. But wealth draws attention, and attention up here gets you killed. So you've just been sitting on it for 2 years. It's not going anywhere, and neither was I. He glanced at her. Until you showed up. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. What does that mean? Rhett was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was different, softer. Means maybe I want to live past next month now. Means maybe I've got a reason to care whether Voss wins or not. The words hung in the cold air between them. Mara felt her heart kick against her ribs, felt heat rise to her face despite the temperature. Rhett, don't, not yet. He turned back toward the trail. Let's get back. Don't want to be away from the cabin too long. They walked back in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with things unsaid, with possibilities neither of them was ready to name. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in the loft, listening to the wind and Rhett's breathing from below, thinking about everything that had changed in a month. She'd come to this mountain expecting nothing, hoping for basic survival, and instead she'd found something else, something that felt dangerously close to home. She was still awake when she heard it, the soft whistle, barely audible over the wind. Rhett heard it too. She could tell by the way his breathing changed, by the creak of the bench as he sat up. Then he was moving, fast and silent. "Mara, get down here, now." She scrambled down the ladder, still in her nightgown. Rhett thrust a rifle into her hands, pressed ammunition into her pockets. "They're here. At least 6 of them, probably more. I need you at the east window. Anyone comes into your line of sight, you fire. Don't hesitate, don't think, just fire. Can you do that?" Mara's mouth was dry as bone, but she nodded. "Good." He moved to the north window, dropped the board into place, leaving just a narrow gap to shoot through. "Remember your training. Breathe. Aim. Fire." The cabin went dark. Rhett had doused the lanterns the moment he heard the signal. Mara positioned herself at the east window, rifle braced against her shoulder, heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack a rib. For a long moment, nothing. Just darkness and wind and the sound of her own pulse in her ears. Then movement. A shadow detaching from the tree line, moving toward the cabin in a crouch. Then another. Then 3 more. "Rat!" Mara's voice came out as a hiss. "I see them! Wait!" The shadows came closer. 50 yards, 40, 30. Mara could see them more clearly now, men with rifles, spreading out to surround the cabin. Her finger trembled on the trigger. "Calder!" A voice rang out across the clearing. "Voss. I know you can hear me. Come out and we'll talk like civilized men." Rhett didn't answer. "Have it your way." Voss raised his hand, and even in the darkness, Mara could see the signal. "Burn it." 2 men ran forward, carrying something that sloshed. Kerosene, Mara realized with horror. They were going to burn them out. Rhett's rifle cracked, impossibly loud in the confined space. One of the men with the kerosene went down, the can spinning away from his hands. The second man dropped his can and ran. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, bullets slamming into the cabin's walls, punching through windows, filling the air with splinters and the smell of gunpowder. Mara ducked instinctively, then forced herself back up. Through the narrow gap in the window, she could see men advancing, using trees and rocks for cover. She aimed at the nearest one, a big man with a rifle almost as tall as he was. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the gun steady. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, the noise deafening. The big man didn't go down. She'd missed, or hit something that didn't matter. He turned toward her window, brought up his rifle. Mara fired again and again. The third shot connected. The man stumbled, went to one knee. "Good!" Rhett shouted over the chaos. "Keep firing!" She did. Loaded and fired and loaded again, not thinking, just following the training Rhett had drilled into her. Her shoulder went numb from the recoil. Her ears rang until she couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched whine, but she kept shooting. Rhett was firing too, methodical and precise. Every shot from his rifle meant something. A man going down, a man scrambling for cover, a man deciding this job wasn't worth dying for. But there were too many of them. For every one that fell back, another moved up to take his place. A crash from the back of the cabin, someone breaking through the small storage room window. Rhett spun, fired twice. A scream, then silence. But the distraction cost him. More men rushed the front, got within 20 yards before Rhett could get back to his position. Mara tried to cover them, but her rifle jammed. She yanked at the bolt, fingers slippery with sweat, fumbling. "Down!" Rhett roared. Mara hit the floor as the window above her exploded inward, glass raining down like deadly rain. She grabbed the revolver from her belt, the one she was terrible with, the one she could barely hit a target with at 20 paces, and rolled to her knees. A man was climbing through the window, rifle slung across his back, knife in his hand. He saw her, grinned. "Well, hello there." Mara shot him in the chest. The revolver's kick nearly broke her wrist, but the man went backward, toppled out the window. Mara stared at her hand, at the gun, at the empty window. She'd just killed someone, ended a life. The reality of it crashed over her like ice water, and for a moment she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't... "Mara!" Rhett's voice cut through the shock. "Stay with me!" She shook herself, forced the nausea down. There would be time for falling apart later. Right now, they were still under siege. She got her rifle working again, returned to the window. The attackers had pulled back slightly, regrouping in the tree line. Rhett was reloading, movements fast and efficient despite the blood running down his left arm. "You're hit," Mara said. "Graze. I'm fine." He slammed a fresh magazine into the rifle. "They're going to try again. Be ready." But the attack didn't come. Instead, voices in the darkness, arguing, it sounded like. Then retreat. The sound of horses moving away fast. The silence that followed was almost worse than the gunfire. "Are they gone?" Mara whispered. Rhett didn't lower his rifle. "Maybe. Or maybe they're trying to draw us out." He stayed at the window, barely breathing, listening. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing. "I think they left," Rhett said finally. "Either we hurt them worse than they expected, or they decided the pay wasn't worth dying for." He set down his rifle finally, and the tension in his shoulders eased fractionally. "Check yourself. Are you hit anywhere?" Mara looked down at herself, surprised to find she didn't know. The adrenaline had burned away everything else. But no, she was intact. Shaking and sick and terrified, but intact. "I'm fine." "Good. Keep your rifle. We're going to check the perimeter, make sure they're really gone." "Is that smart?" "No, but we can't sit in here all night wondering if they're waiting outside." He picked up a lantern, kept it shuttered. "Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" They moved outside together into a clearing that looked like a battlefield. Shell casings everywhere, scorch marks where the kerosene can had spilled and someone had tried to light it, and bodies. 3 of them, sprawled where they'd fallen. Mara had to turn away from that, had to swallow hard against the bile rising in her throat. Rhett checked each body methodically, making sure they were dead and not just playing possum. Then he moved to the tree line, rifle up, searching for any sign of an ambush. Nothing. They were alone. "They ran," Rhett said, and there was something like surprise in his voice. "We held them off." Mara sat down hard on the porch steps, her legs finally giving out. "How many were there? 8, maybe 9? Hard to tell in the dark." He came to sit beside her, wincing as he moved. "You did good tonight. Real good." "I killed someone." Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "You defended yourself. Defended us. There's a difference." "Is there?" Rhett was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, there is. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but there is." He put his hand on her shoulder, squeezed gently. "You're going to feel it tomorrow. Maybe for a lot of tomorrows. But you did what had to be done, and you didn't freeze up. That takes strength most people don't have." Mara looked at the clearing, at the evidence of what they'd survived. "Will Voss come back? I don't know. We made him pay a heavy price tonight, losing 3 men, maybe more. That's going to make him think twice." Rhett stood, offered her his hand. "But we can't assume he's done. We need to prepare like he's coming back tomorrow." She took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. "Then we prepare." They spent what remained of the night cleaning up, dragged the bodies away from the cabin, covered them with rocks, collected the spent brass, boarded up the broken window, swept up the glass. As dawn broke, the cabin looked almost normal again. Almost. But everything had changed. Mara could feel it in the way she moved now, more careful, more aware. In the way her hand kept finding the revolver at her belt, making sure it was there. In the way every sound made her tense, ready for another attack. Rhett's arm needed stitching. Mara made him sit while she cleaned the wound, a deep graze that had bled more than he'd admitted, and sewed it closed with hands that only shook a little. He bore it without complaint, didn't even flinch when the needle went in. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "My mother. She was a seamstress. Said skin wasn't much different from fabric if you knew what you were doing." Mara tied off the last stitch, cut the thread. "She was wrong about a lot of things, but that one stuck. Remind me to thank her." "Can't. She's been dead 12 years. "Then I'll thank you instead." He flexed his arm carefully, testing the stitches. "Good work." They made coffee, drank it standing up, both of them too wired to sit. The sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, and it was so beautiful it almost hurt. How could the world look like this after what they'd just survived? "What do we do now?" Mara asked. Rhett set down his cup, looked at her with those careful, controlled eyes. "We wait. We watch. And we hope that Voss decides a silver vein isn't worth any more dead men. And if he doesn't, then we fight again. Simple as that. No bravado, no false promises, just the truth." Mara thought about that, about what it meant to choose to stay, knowing what might come. She could leave now, ride down to Red Hollow, get on a train, disappear into some city where Harlan Voss's reach didn't extend, start over somewhere safer, somewhere easier. But she didn't want easy, didn't want safe, not if it meant running from the first real home she'd found in years. "I'm staying," she said. "Whatever comes, I'm staying." Rhett studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. "Then we'll face it together." They stood there on the porch, watching the sun climb, and Mara felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, there was no peace in waiting for the next attack, but certainty. She'd chosen this mountain, this cabin, this man, and she'd defend all of it with everything she had. 3 days passed, then a week. The waiting stretched thin again, but different now. They'd proven they could hold the cabin, could fight back. That changed things. Rhett taught her more. How to set tripwires around the perimeter, how to read tracks and know how old they were, how to move silently through the forest. She learned which trees made the best cover, which sight lines gave the best field of fire, which approaches to the cabin were most vulnerable. They were building something together, she realized. Not just defenses, but trust. Every lesson Rhett taught her, every skill she mastered, it was him saying, "I believe you can do this. I trust you to stand beside me." And every time she didn't run, every morning she woke up and chose to stay, she was saying, "I'm not going anywhere. This is where I belong." 2 weeks after the attack, a single rider appeared on the trail. Not Voss. Rhett would have shot him on sight. This was someone else, younger, carrying a white flag. They watched him approach, rifles ready. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, hands visible and empty. "Message from Mr. Voss," the young man called out. His voice shook slightly. "He says to tell you he's willing to negotiate. Says maybe there's a way both parties can walk away satisfied." Rhett stepped out onto the porch, rifle held casual, but ready. "Tell Voss I'm not interested in negotiations. Tell him the next time he sends men up this mountain, they don't go back down. Tell him to ask the 3 we buried how serious I am about that." The young man swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I'll tell him. And tell him one more thing." Rhett's voice went cold and hard. "Tell him my wife is as good a shot as I am now. Tell him that if he comes back, he's fighting 2 people who won't quit, won't run, and won't miss. Tell him to think real hard about whether that silver is worth dying for." The messenger nodded frantically, turned his horse, and rode away like the devil himself was chasing him. Mara came to stand beside Rhett on the porch. "My wife," she said quietly. "You called me your wife. You are my wife." He glanced at her. "On paper, anyway." "On paper." She let the words hang there for a moment. "Is that all?" Rhett turned to face her fully, and she could see him wrestling with something, could see the careful control starting to crack. "No," he said finally. "That's not all. Hasn't been for a while now." "Then what am I?" "You're—" He stopped, started again. "You're the first person in 5 years who made me want to wake up in the morning. You're the reason I give a damn if Voss wins or not. You're—" He shook his head, frustrated with words that wouldn't come. "I'm not good at this. Talking about feelings and such." Mara reached out, took his hand. It was scarred and rough and twice the size of hers, and it felt exactly right. "You don't have to be good at it, just be honest." "Honest." He looked down at their joined hands. "All right. Honest is, I'm falling for you, Mara Quinn. Have been since the day you didn't run when I told you what was coming. Since the day you stood at that window and fought like you had everything to lose. Maybe even before that." Her heart was doing complicated things in her chest, acrobatics it had no business attempting. "I'm falling for you too. Have been since you looked at me like I was a person instead of a problem." They stood there on the porch, hands linked, and it should have been a perfect moment. But this was real life, and real life didn't give you perfect moments. Real life gave you moments stolen between threats, happiness carved out of danger, love built on uncertain ground, and somehow that made it matter more. Rhett pulled her closer, and Mara went, let herself lean into his warmth. "We might not survive this," he said quietly. "Voss might come back with an army, might decide to starve us out, burn us out, whatever it takes." "I know. And you're still staying." "I'm still staying." She looked up at him. "Because whatever time we have, I want to spend it here, with you, fighting for something that matters instead of just surviving someone else's judgment of whether I'm worth the space I take up." Rhett's hand came up to cup her face, gentle despite the calluses, despite the scars. "You're worth every damn inch, Mara. Every pound, every breath, every stubborn thought in that head of yours. And anyone who made you think otherwise was a fool." Then he kissed her, slow and careful, like she was something precious, like she mattered. And for the first time in her entire life, Mara believed it might actually be true. When they pulled apart, the sun was fully up, the day stretching ahead of them with all its chores and challenges and the ever-present threat of violence. But they'd face it together now, as partners in every sense of the word. Whatever came next, they'd be ready. The messenger's visit bought them 10 days of quiet. 10 days where Mara and Rhett moved through their routines with weapons always within reach, where every sound from the forest made them pause and listen, where they slept in shifts and woke at the slightest disturbance. But they were days nonetheless, and they used them. Rhett reinforced the cabin's defenses, adding shutters that could be barred from inside, digging shallow trenches around the perimeter that would trip up anyone approaching in the dark. Mara helped where she could, learning as she worked. Her hands blistered and bled, then calloused over. Her shoulders ached from hauling logs and stones, but the ache was proof of work done, of preparation that might save their lives. At night they talked. Real conversations now, not just the practical exchanges about chores and weather. Rhett told her about growing up in Virginia, about parents who'd died of cholera when he was 16, about drifting west because there was nothing left for him in the East, about the war that had taken pieces of him he'd never gotten back. "I was 21 when it started," he said one evening, oiling his rifle by lamplight. "Thought I knew everything, thought war would be noble, heroic, all the things young idiots think before they learn better." "What did you learn?" Mara asked from her spot at the table, mending a shirt that had gotten torn during the attack. "That there's nothing noble about killing. That heroism is just another word for surviving when everyone around you doesn't. That the things you do in war, they don't stay there. They follow you home." He set down the rifle, stared at his hands. "I killed a lot of men during those years. Some deserved it, some didn't. Most were just scared boys like me, following orders, trying not to die. And every single one of them haunts me." Mara's needle paused mid-stitch. "Is that why you came up here, to get away from the ghosts?" "Partly. Thought maybe if I got far enough away from people, I could outrun what I'd done. Turns out you can't outrun yourself." He looked at her. Meeting Sarah helped, though. She didn't try to fix me or make me talk about things I couldn't talk about. She just accepted that some parts of me were broken and loved me anyway. "You're not broken," Mara said quietly. "Yeah, I am. Just learn to live with it." He picked up the rifle again, went back to his work. "We all carry damage, Mara. Trick is finding someone who doesn't mind carrying some of it with you." She thought about that, about all the weight she'd carried alone for so long. The shame of never being the right size, the right shape, the right kind of woman. The constant feeling of being too much and not enough at the same time. "I spent my whole life being told I was broken too. Wrong, anyway, like I'd failed some test just by existing." "Their test was rigged. You didn't fail anything." "Feels like I did sometimes. Even up here, even now, there's this voice in my head that says, I don't deserve this. That you'll wake up one day and realize you made a mistake choosing me." Rhett set down the rifle with enough force that it made a sound against the table. He crossed to her, knelt down so they were eye level. "Listen to me. That voice is a liar. You belong here. You've earned your place on this mountain 10 times over, and I didn't make a mistake. I made the smartest choice of my life." Mara felt tears prick at her eyes, blinked them back. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've lived with mistakes, and I know what they feel like. This isn't one." He took her hand, rough palm against rough palm. "You want the truth? I'm the one who doesn't deserve you. I brought you up here knowing danger was coming, knowing Voss would make a move eventually. I should have warned you before we ever left Red Hollow. Would you have chosen me if you'd known I'd say yes anyway?" He smiled, small and real. "Yeah, I would have." "Then stop second-guessing it. We're here. We chose this. Both of us." That night, Mara didn't sleep in the loft. They lay together on the wide bench by the fire, wrapped in quilts, listening to the wind howl outside. It wasn't the romantic scenario from books. The bench was too narrow, they were both too big for the space, and someone's elbow kept jabbing someone else's ribs. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that made it perfect enough. The 10 days ended on a gray morning that felt like a bruise. Mara woke to Rhett already up, standing at the window with that tense stillness that meant something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, reaching for her rifle before her eyes were fully open. "Riders coming up the main trail." His voice was flat, controlled. "At least a dozen of them. Maybe more." Mara scrambled to the window. Sure enough, a line of horses was winding its way up the mountain, moving slowly but deliberately. At the front rode Harlan Voss, and even from this distance, Mara could see the confidence in the way he sat his saddle, like he'd already won. "He brought an army," she said. "Not quite, but close enough." Rhett was already moving, checking weapons, positioning ammunition. "They'll try to surround us first, cut off any escape routes. Then they'll either demand we surrender or just start shooting. We held them off before. We got lucky before. They weren't organized, weren't expecting real resistance. This time they know what they're facing." He handed her the shotgun. "You remember what we talked about, if things go bad?" They discussed it during the quiet days, though neither of them had wanted to. If the cabin was about to be overrun, if there was no other choice, Mara was supposed to take Maple and run for Red Hollow while Rhett covered her escape. She'd agreed to the plan while privately deciding she'd never follow it. "I remember," she said, which wasn't a lie. The riders stopped at the edge of rifle range, just far enough away that shooting at them would waste ammunition. Voss dismounted, walked forward a few paces, hands visible and empty. Behind him, his men spread out in a semicircle, rifles ready but not aimed. Yet. "Calder!" Voss's voice carried across the clearing. "I'm here to make one final offer. Hear me out before you start shooting." Rhett opened the door but stayed inside, rifle braced against the frame. "Talk fast. I'm offering you $5,000 for this land. More than fair, considering you've put 3 of my men in the ground. You take the money, ride down the mountain with your woman, and start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere safer." "Not interested." "Don't be stupid, Rhett. Look around you. I've got 15 men out here, and every one of them is a professional. You're good, I'll grant you that. But you're not good enough to hold off 15 rifles. Not for long. I've held off worse odds. In the war, maybe. But this isn't the war, and you've got more to lose now." Voss glanced toward the cabin, and even from inside, Mara could feel the weight of his gaze trying to find her. "You've got a wife to think about. Is your pride really worth getting her killed?" Rhett's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Mara makes her own choices. She chose to stay." "Then she's as stupid as you are." Voss's pleasant tone cracked slightly, showing the anger underneath. "I'm trying to be reasonable here, trying to solve this without more bloodshed. But if you force my hand, nobody's forcing anything. You're the one who rode up here with an army. You're the one making threats. I'm just defending what's mine." "What's yours?" Voss laughed, harsh and ugly. "You don't own this land, Calder. You're squatting on it, same as any claim jumper. My family has legal documentation going back 30 years proving we own this whole valley. Your family's documentation is forged, and you know it. I've seen the real claims at the federal office. This is homestead land, and my claim is legal and filed proper. Legal doesn't mean much this far from civilization." Voss spread his hands. "I didn't want it to come to this. I really didn't. But you're leaving me no choice." "There's always a choice. You could turn around and ride back down. Not without what I came for." Voss's expression hardened. "Last chance, Calder. Take the money and walk away. Or don't walk away at all." Rhett's answer was to raise his rifle slightly, not quite aiming, but close enough to make the point. Voss nodded, like Rhett had confirmed something he'd already known. "So be it. Boys, take positions. Nobody fires until I give the word, but when I do, you make sure neither of them walks out of that cabin alive." The men moved with military precision, spreading out to surround the cabin completely. Rhett closed the door, barred it, turned to Mara. "This is it. Last chance to run." "I'm not running." "Mara, I said I'm not running." She moved to her position at the east window, checked her rifle's load. "We hold them off or we die trying. Either way, we do it together." Something fierce and proud flashed across Rhett's face. "All right then, together." They waited. The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind and the occasional sound of horses shifting nervously. Voss's men were positioned now, rifles aimed at the cabin from all sides. There was no way out, no escape route they hadn't covered. "Calder," Voss called out, "I'm going to count to 10. If that door isn't open and you're not walking out with your hands up, we start shooting and we don't stop until that cabin is kindling." Rhett didn't respond. 1. Mara's hands were steady on her rifle. Strange how calm she felt, like some part of her had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it without knowing. 2. "You scared?" Rhett asked quietly. "Terrified. You?" "Same." He almost smiled. "Good to know fear still works." 3. If we survive this, Mara said, I want to actually have a wedding, not just signing papers, but a real ceremony. Something that means something. 4. Deal. And I want to show you the valley in spring. When the wildflowers bloom, you can't even imagine how beautiful. 5. They were talking about the future like they'd have one. Like 15 armed men weren't about to try killing them. Maybe that was its own kind of courage. 6. Rhett, I love you. He looked at her, and his eyes held everything words couldn't say. I love you too, Mara. Whatever happens next, know that. 7. The moment crystallized. Mara could see every detail, the way dust motes floated in the lamplight, the grain of the wood on her rifle stock, the scar on Rhett's cheekbone from some old fight. She'd remember this, she thought. If she lived, she'd remember exactly how this felt. 8. Here we go, Rhett said, positioning himself at the north window. 9. Mara took a breath, held it, let it out slow. 10. Light them up. Gunfire exploded from every direction. Bullets slammed into the cabin's walls, shattered the remaining glass in the windows, punched holes through the shutters. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous roar of destruction. Mara fired back, aiming for muzzle flashes in the tree line. Couldn't tell if she was hitting anything, couldn't stop to check, just kept firing and reloading and firing again. Beside her, Rhett's rifle cracked with steady rhythm, each shot deliberate and controlled. East side, Rhett shouted. 3 of them moving up. Mara swung her rifle toward the approaching men. They were using the outbuildings for cover, leapfrogging from the woodpile to the chicken coop to the lean-to. She fired, saw one stumble. Fired again, saw another drop, but more kept coming. For every one they stopped, 2 more appeared. Voss had brought enough men to overwhelm them through sheer numbers, and it was working. A bullet punched through the shutter next to Mara's head, showering her with splinters. She ducked, came back up, kept firing. Her shoulder was one massive bruise from the rifle's recoil. Her ears rang so badly she could barely hear anything except the gunfire, but she didn't stop. They're at the door, Rhett yelled, abandoning his window to aim at the front entrance. Heavy impacts shook the door, someone ramming it with something, trying to break through the bar. The wood groaned, started to splinter. Rhett fired through the door, twice, 3 times. A scream from outside, then the impact stopped. But the respite didn't last. Men appeared at multiple windows simultaneously trying to climb through. Mara shot one, but another made it inside, rifle swinging toward her. She didn't think, just reacted. Dropped her rifle, drew the revolver from her belt, and fired point blank. The man went down hard. Behind you! Rhett's voice cut through the chaos. Mara spun. Another man coming through the east window. She fired again and again, pulling the trigger until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. Rhett was there suddenly, shotgun in hands, clearing the window with 2 deafening blasts. Then he grabbed Mara's arm, pulled her toward the ladder. Up! Now! They scrambled into the loft just as more men poured through the ground floor. From above, they had the advantage of height and a narrower field to defend. Rhett fired down into the cabin, driving the attackers back. But there were too many, way too many. We can't hold this, Mara shouted over the gunfire. I know! Rhett was reloading with hands that moved like lightning. But we make them pay for every inch. Something crashed below, the table overturning, men using it for cover. Smoke was starting to fill the cabin, acrid and choking. One of them had managed to light something, Mara realized with horror. They were being burned out after all. Rhett, the fire, I see it. He fired down again, trying to hit whoever was feeding the flames. But the smoke was too thick now, obscuring everything. They were going to die up here, trapped in the loft while the cabin burned around them, while Voss's men waited outside to shoot anyone who tried to escape. This was how it ended. Mara looked at Rhett, saw the same realization in his eyes. He reached for her hand, gripped it tight. I'm sorry, he said. I'm so sorry I brought you into this. Don't. She squeezed back hard. I chose this. I'd choose it again. The smoke was getting thicker, flames visible now through the floorboards. Heat rose in waves, making the air shimmer. Below, men were coughing, retreating from the fire they'd started. And then, gunfire. But different. Coming from outside the cabin, not aimed at them. Rhett's head snapped up. What? More shots, rapid and organized. Shouts of confusion from Voss's men. The sound of horses screaming. Someone was attacking the attackers. Rhett crawled to the loft's small window, the one that faced west, looked out. His expression changed, shifted into something between shock and disbelief. "It's the town," he said. "Red Hollow." They came. Mara scrambled to look. Through the smoke and chaos, she could see them, maybe 20 men on horseback, rifles blazing, hitting Voss's forces from behind. And at the front, leading the charge, was the young man who'd almost chosen her on the platform. The one with kind eyes who'd stepped back when his friend whispered. He wasn't stepping back now. The battle shifted instantly. Voss's men, caught between the cabin and the townspeople, broke formation. Some tried to fight, some tried to run, and in the confusion, the organized assault fell apart completely. "We need to get out of here before the whole cabin goes up," Rhett said, already moving toward the ladder. The fire had spread to the walls now, eating through the dry wood with terrifying speed. They climbed down into smoke so thick Mara could barely see her own hands. The heat was incredible, like standing too close to a forge. Rhett grabbed her hand, led her toward the door, stepping over bodies and debris. The door was already open, kicked in or burned through, Mara couldn't tell which. They stumbled out into cold air that felt like ice after the inferno inside. The clearing was chaos. Men fighting hand to hand, horses rearing and screaming, gunfire still crackling from the tree line. Through it all, Mara could see Voss backing toward his horse, firing wildly at anyone who came near. His eyes landed on her, and something twisted in his expression. Rage, maybe. Or recognition that he'd lost. He raised his rifle, aimed directly at Mara. Time slowed. She could see his finger tightening on the trigger, could see the barrel lining up with her chest. She was too far from cover, too exposed. This was it. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She'd fought for this place, for this life, and if this was how it ended... The shot came from her left. Not Voss's rifle. Someone else's. Voss stumbled, looks down at the red spreading across his shirt. His rifle fell from his hands. He turned, saw Mara standing there with the smoking revolver, saw the determination in her eyes. "You..." he started. Mara fired again, and again, emptying the cylinder into the man who'd tried to take everything from them. Voss fell, stayed down. The gunfire sputtered out. Voss's remaining men, seeing their leader dead, threw down their weapons. The townspeople rounded them up, disarmed them, while Mara stood frozen, the empty revolver still extended. Rhett was beside her suddenly, gently lowering her arm. "It's over. It's done." She looked at him, at the cabin burning behind them, at the bodies scattered across the clearing. "We won? We won." He pulled her close, and she was shaking now, the adrenaline draining away and leaving nothing but exhaustion and shock. "We survived." The young man from Red Hollow approached, careful and respectful. Up close, Mara could see blood on his sleeve, a cut above his eye. "Mrs. Calder, Mr. Calder, are you all right?" "Why did you come?" Mara asked. "Why did any of you come?" He looked uncomfortable. "After Voss's messenger came back, after what he said about you two holding off his men, it started people talking, made us realize Voss had been pushing everyone around for too long, taking what he wanted, and we'd all just let it happen because we were scared." He gestured to the men behind him, townspeople Mara vaguely recognized from that first day. "We figured if you two could stand up to him, maybe we could too. So when we heard he was riding up here with an army, we followed. Couldn't let him murder good people just for doing what we all should have done years ago." "You saved our lives," Rhett said quietly. "You gave us the courage to fight back. Figured it was only fair we returned the favor." The young man glanced at the burning cabin. "Looks like you're going to need a place to stay, though. Cabin's not salvageable." Mara looked at the flames consuming everything they'd built, everything they'd defended. She should have felt devastated. Instead, she felt free. "We'll rebuild," she said, bigger, better, and this time we won't be alone. They watched the cabin burn through the night, all of them, Mara and Rhett, the men from Red Hollow, even Voss's captured gunmen who sat bound and guarded at the edge of the clearing. The fire consumed everything with an appetite that seemed personal. The walls collapsed inward, sending showers of sparks into the dark sky. The roof went next, caving in with a groan that sounded almost human. By dawn, nothing remained but blackened timbers and ash, still smoking in the cold morning air. Mara stood wrapped in the blanket someone from town had brought, watching the embers glow. She should have felt destroyed. Everything they'd built, everything they'd fought for, reduced to ruins. But all she felt was tired. Bone-deep, soul-weary tired. "You all right?" Rhett asked, coming to stand beside her. He had ash in his hair, blood on his shirt from a cut he hadn't mentioned, and his eyes were red from smoke and exhaustion. I don't know yet, Mara said honestly. Ask me in a week. Fair enough. The young man from town, his name was Daniel, Mara had learned, approached with 2 cups of coffee that smelled like heaven and probably tasted like mud. They took them anyway, grateful for the warmth. We're taking Voss's men down to Red Hollow, Daniel said. Sheriff will have to decide what to do with them, and we'll need to send word to the territorial marshal about Voss. His family will want the body, I expect. Let them have it, Rhett said. I'm done with the whole business. Daniel nodded, then hesitated. There's talk in town, you know, about what happened here, about how you two held off Voss's first attack, and how Mrs. Calder was the one who brought him down in the end. He looked at Mara with something like awe. People are saying you're the toughest woman in the territory. Mara almost laughed. Toughest woman in the territory. A month ago, she'd been the unwanted bride nobody would claim. Funny how fast things changed when you stopped caring what people thought and started caring what you thought of yourself. I'm just someone who didn't run when running would have been easier, she said. That's the definition of tough, Daniel replied. He glanced at the ruins of the cabin. When you're ready to rebuild, you let us know. The town owes you. We'll send men and materials, help you get set up again before winter really hits. Rhett looked surprised. That's generous. It's what neighbors do. Should have been doing it all along instead of letting Voss push everyone around. Daniel drained his coffee, made a face at the taste. We're learning, I guess. Better late than never. After the townspeople left with their prisoners, Mara and Rhett were alone on the mountain again. The animals had survived. The horses were spooked but unharmed, and most of the chickens had scattered during the fight but would likely come back when they got hungry. The outbuildings were damaged but standing. It could have been worse. It could have been so much worse. Where do we even start? Mara asked, looking at the destruction. Rhett surveyed the wreckage with the calculating eye of someone who'd built things before and would build them again. We start by salvaging what we can. Anything that didn't burn, we save. Then we clear the site, lay a new foundation, and build it back. Stronger this time. How long will that take? Through winter, probably into spring. We'll need to camp rough until we get at least a basic shelter up. He looked at her. It won't be easy, and that's assuming Voss's family doesn't come looking for revenge, or his hired guns don't decide to finish what they started, or a dozen other things that could go wrong. Mara thought about that, about how much easier it would be to walk away, to take what little they had left and start over somewhere else. Somewhere safer, somewhere without ghosts and burned buildings and bodies buried in shallow graves. But that's all she'd ever done. Walk away. Leave before the leaving got done to her first. And where had it gotten her? A life lived in other people's spaces, on other people's terms, always waiting for the moment they'd decide she wasn't worth keeping around. I'm not leaving, she said. This is our mountain, our land. Nobody's taking it from us. Rhett's expression softened into something she couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or love. Probably both. Then we stay, and we rebuild. They spent that first day doing exactly what Rhett had said, salvaging. The fire had been hot and thorough, but some things had survived. The iron stove, twisted and blackened, but still functional. A few tools from the outbuildings. Some of the books, protected by the metal trunk they'd been stored in. And buried in the ash, Mara found something that made her throat tight. Sarah's silver brush, the one Mara had been using. Tarnished and heat-warped, but intact. She held it in her hand, this remnant of a woman she'd never met. A woman whose husband Mara had married, whose place Mara had tried to fill without ever being asked to. It should have felt strange, or wrong, or like she was somehow trespassing on sacred ground. Instead, it felt like a gift, like permission. I found this, she said, showing Rhett when he came to check on her progress. He took the brush, turned it over in his scarred hands. Sarah would have wanted you to have it. She was practical like that. Would have said it's stupid to let something useful go to waste just because the person who owned it is gone. You think she would have liked me? Rhett considered the question seriously, didn't rush to an easy answer. Yeah, I think she would have. You're both stubborn in the same way, both stronger than you look. Both see through nonsense to what matters. He handed the brush back. And I think she'd be glad I didn't spend the rest of my life alone on this mountain, turning into some kind of hermit ghost. You were already halfway there when I arrived. Exactly. You saved me from myself. He kissed her forehead, gentle despite the ash and blood and exhaustion coating them both. Come on. We've got a long day ahead, and I want to get the tent set up before dark. They'd borrowed a canvas tent from Daniel, one of many supplies the town had insisted on providing. It was military surplus, patched in a dozen places, but it was shelter. Rhett erected it near where the cabin had stood, close enough to the ruins that they could keep an eye on their salvage, but far enough that they weren't breathing ash all night. That first night in the tent was hard. The ground was frozen beneath them despite the layers of blankets and pine boughs Rhett had arranged. The wind cut through the canvas like it wasn't there, and every sound made Mara jolt awake, certain that Voss's men had returned, that the fight wasn't really over. But Rhett was there, solid and warm beside her, and gradually she'd relax enough to drift back into uneasy sleep. They'd wake before dawn, exhausted and aching, and start the whole cycle again. Days bled into weeks. They cleared the rubble, sorted through the ash, saved what could be saved, and buried the rest. The work was backbreaking and endless, but slowly, so slowly, progress emerged. The site was cleared. A new foundation was dug and laid with stones hauled from the mountainside. The first logs were raised for walls. True to his word, Daniel returned with 6 men from Red Hollow, bringing lumber and nails and actual skilled labor. They worked alongside Rhett and Mara, and if they found it odd that the woman was doing the same heavy lifting as the men, they kept it to themselves. Mara had proven herself in ways that made questions about proper women's work seem stupid. "You're building bigger than before," one of the men observed, watching Rhett mark out the dimensions. "Need the space," Rhett said. "Figure if we're going to do this, we do it right." What he didn't say, but Mara understood, was that the new cabin wasn't just for them. It was a statement, a declaration that they weren't hiding anymore, weren't just surviving on the margins. They were building a life that had room in it for other people, for community, for a future that extended beyond just making it through the next winter. The work went faster with help, but it still took time. Winter settled in fully, bringing snow that made construction nearly impossible on the worst days. They'd huddle in the tent during blizzards, burning through their carefully rationed firewood, eating cold meals because starting a fire in the tent was too risky. One particularly bad storm trapped them for 3 days. By the second day, they'd run out of things to talk about and had moved into a comfortable silence. Mara was attempting to repair one of her dresses by lamplight, while Rhett whittled at a piece of wood, making something she couldn't quite identify. "I've been thinking," he said, not looking up from his work. "Dangerous habit," he smiled slightly. "About the silver, about what we should do with it." Mara set down her sewing. They hadn't talked about the silver vein since the fight, hadn't discussed what would happen now that Voss was dead and his claim to the land had died with him. "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to leave it alone, pretend it doesn't exist. That way nobody else comes after it, nobody else dies for it." He turned the wood over, studying it. "But another part thinks maybe that's wasteful. Maybe we could use it to build something good. School in Red Hollow, maybe. Or help families who are struggling to make it through winter. That would change everything. Once people know it's there." "I know. That's why I haven't decided." He looked at her. "It's your decision too. Your land as much as mine now. What do you think?" Mara thought about it. About the men who'd died fighting over something they'd never seen, never touched. About how money and greed had nearly destroyed everything they'd built. About how the promise of wealth could corrupt even good people. But she also thought about the town that had ridden up the mountain to save them. About Daniel and the other men who were helping rebuild, expecting nothing in return. About how resources, used right, could do more than just make people rich. They could give them chances they wouldn't have otherwise. "I think we wait," she said finally. "Get through this winter, get the cabin built, get settled, then we make a decision with clear heads, not while we're still fighting to survive. And whatever we decide, we do it together." Rhett nodded slowly. "Together. I like the sound of that." The storm broke on the 4th day, and they emerged from the tent to find the world transformed into something from a dream. Everything was white and clean, the ugliness of the burned cabin site buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. The sun came out, blindingly bright, and for a moment Mara just stood there, breathing in air so cold and clean it hurt. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Rhett said beside her. "Yeah, it really is." They got back to work. The walls went up slowly, log by log. The men from town came when they could, bringing news and gossip along with labor. Voss's family had sent lawyers, angry and demanding, but with their patriarch dead and his hired guns either in jail or scattered, they had no leverage. The territorial marshal had investigated, declared the shooting justified self-defense, and closed the case. The land was officially Rhett and Mara's. No dispute, no question. Heard they're trying to sell off Voss's holdings, Daniel said one day, helping Rhett fit a window frame. All the land he'd grabbed from other people, it's going back on the market. Some of the families he'd forced out are buying back their original claims. Good, Mara said from where she was chinking gaps between logs with moss and mud. That's how it should be. There's talk about you two in town, Daniel continued. Some folks saying what you did was murder, that Voss should have had a trial. But most people are saying you did what had to be done, that sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. Mara thought about the moment she'd pulled that trigger, about the weight of it, the finality. She'd killed a man. That fact didn't get lighter with time, didn't get easier to carry, but she'd do it again if she had to, and she'd learn to live with that truth. I'm not proud of it, she said quietly, but I'm not sorry either. He would have killed us both and never lost a night's sleep over it. I know. Everyone knows. Daniel hammered in another nail. That's why they respect you, not because you killed him, but because you stood your ground when running would have been easier. By late winter, the cabin had walls, a roof, and windows. It wasn't finished. The interior was still raw and rough, the floor just packed earth, the furniture non-existent. But it was shelter, real shelter, warm and solid and theirs. The first night they slept inside, Mara lay on a bedroll on the dirt floor and felt like royalty. No wind cutting through canvas, no frost forming on the inside of the tent, no wondering if the whole structure would collapse under the weight of snow. Just solid walls and a real ceiling and the soft crackle of fire in the stove Rhett had salvaged and repaired. We did it, she said into the darkness. Not done yet. Still needs a lot of work. But we did it. We survived. We rebuilt. We won. Rhett's hand found hers in the dark, squeezed. Yeah, we did. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, like it couldn't quite believe winter would actually let it through. But it came. Snow melted, revealing the scars in the earth where men had bled and died. Wildflowers pushed through the mud, stubborn and beautiful. The chickens that had scattered during the fight came back, along with a few extras they'd apparently recruited from somewhere. Life reasserted itself with the same determination Mara had learned to recognize in herself. With Daniel's help, they organized a real wedding. Nothing fancy, just a gathering in Red Hollow's small church, with half the town crammed inside to watch. Mara wore a dress borrowed from one of the town women, altered to fit her broader frame. Rhett wore clean clothes and looked uncomfortable but determined. The preacher kept it simple, which Mara appreciated. No flowery speeches about women obeying their husbands or men being the head of the household. Just the basics. Do you promise to love and stand by each other in good times and bad for as long as you both live? They did. They had been, really, since that first night she'd chosen to stay instead of run. Afterward, there was food and music and people who actually seemed happy for them. The same town that had watched her get rejected on that platform, that had laughed at her humiliation, now celebrated her marriage with genuine warmth. Maybe they'd changed, or maybe she had, and they were just responding to that change. Sarah, the tiny blonde who'd been chosen first from the bride train, sought Mara out during the celebration. She was visibly pregnant now, her young husband hovering nearby with a protective hand on her back. I wanted to apologize, Sarah said quietly, for that day on the platform. I saw what was happening, saw how cruel they were being, and I didn't say anything. I just felt grateful it wasn't me. Mara looked at this delicate woman, so different from herself, and felt no anger. What would you have said? What could you have changed? Nothing, probably, but I still should have tried, should have at least acknowledged that what they were doing was wrong. Sarah twisted her hands together. I heard what you did, though, how you fought Voss and his men, how you saved the whole valley from him. That took real courage, more than I think I have. You'd be surprised what you have in you when you need it, Mara said. I didn't know either, until I had to find out. Sarah smiled, tentative but real. I'm glad you're happy. Glad it worked out. Me too. As summer settled in, the cabin took its final shape. Rhett built furniture, a real bed frame, chairs that didn't wobble, a table big enough to seat 6. Mara planted a garden in the cleared space near the cabin, vegetables and herbs that would feed them through the next winter. They fell into rhythms that felt less like survival and more like living. The silver vein stayed untouched, buried in its mountain hiding place. They'd talked about it more, weighed the options, and finally decided to leave it for now. Maybe someday they'd need it, or maybe they'd find a use for it that didn't involve greed and violence. But for now, they had enough. More than enough. One evening in late summer, they sat on the new porch Rhett had built, watching the sunset over the valley. The town was invisible from here, hidden by distance and terrain, but they could see the smoke from its chimneys rising into the sky, a reminder that they weren't alone anymore, that community existed if they wanted to be part of it. "Do you ever regret it?" Rhett asked. "Choosing this life? You could have had something easier." Mara thought about Philadelphia, about her cousin's cold house and colder reception, about standing on that platform in Red Hollow, being rejected by men who wouldn't have deserved her anyway, about all the years she'd spent trying to be smaller, quieter, less than she was because that's what the world seemed to demand. "No," she said, "I don't regret any of it. This life is hard, but it's mine. Actually mine, not borrowed or conditional on whether I meet someone else's standards, and that's worth everything." Rhett leaned back, satisfied. "Good, because you're stuck with me now. Could be worse fates. Could be better ones, too. Name one." He thought about it, serious and considering. "Can't," he admitted. "This is pretty good." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky shifted through shades of orange and pink and purple. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The mountain answered back with wind through the pines. It was wild and beautiful and sometimes brutal, this life they'd chosen. But it was theirs. Word spread about what had happened on the mountain. The story grew in the telling, the way stories do. Some versions had Mara shooting Voss from impossible distances. Others had her fighting off 20 men single-handed. The truth was less dramatic, but more important. She'd been terrified, and she'd fought anyway. She'd had every reason to run, and she'd stayed. That was the real story. People started coming to them for help. A widow whose land was being threatened by new speculators. A family struggling to defend their claim against squatters. Mara and Rhett couldn't solve every problem, but they tried. And when they couldn't solve it themselves, they gathered others who could. That community Daniel had talked about, it was building itself into something real. By the following spring, the cabin was truly finished. Not just functional, but comfortable, with rugs on the floor and curtains in the windows and shelves lined with books. They'd added a second room for storage and eventually, maybe, for a child if that happened. Neither of them talked about it directly, but the possibility hung in the air, tentative and hopeful. Mara was in the garden one afternoon, pulling weeds and checking the early shoots of vegetables, when she heard horses. Her hand went automatically to the rifle leaning against the fence, a habit that would probably never leave her. But when she looked up, it was just Daniel and 3 other men from town, all of them looking awkward and hesitant. "Afternoon, Mrs. Calder," Daniel called out. "Is Rhett around?" "Up at the north fence, mending wire. Should be back soon." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly, just we wanted to talk to you both about something important." Rhett appeared before Mara could respond, having apparently seen the riders approaching. He nodded to the men, gestured toward the porch. "Come on up. I'll get coffee going." They settled around the table inside and Daniel cleared his throat nervously. "We've been talking in town. About leadership. About what comes next now that Voss is gone. Red Hollow needs someone to represent it to the territorial government, someone to stand up for the people here." "Makes sense," Rhett said. "Who are you thinking?" "You. Both of you, actually." Daniel looked between them. "People trust you. They saw what you did, how you didn't back down when backing down would have been easier. And Mrs. Calder, Mara, you've become kind of a symbol. The woman who wouldn't be dismissed, who fought back and won." Mara felt heat rise to her face. "I'm not a symbol. I'm just someone who didn't want to die." Maybe that's exactly what we need, someone who understands that survival sometimes means fighting, and that fighting doesn't make you less civilized, it makes you free. Daniel leaned forward, earnest. "We're not asking you to move down to town or change your lives, just to be voices for the people up here, to make sure we're not forgotten or pushed around by whoever tries to fill Voss's shoes next." Rhett looked at Mara, a question in his eyes. She thought about it, about adding more responsibility to their already full lives, about taking on other people's problems when they had plenty of their own. But she also thought about that platform in Red Hollow, about being unwanted and dismissed, and how different things might have been if someone like her had been in a position to speak up. "All right," she said. "We'll do it, but on our terms. We're not politicians, and we're not going to pretend to be. We just tell the truth as we see it and try to help where we can." "That's all we're asking," Daniel said, relief obvious on his face. So they became, in their way, leaders. not through seeking power, but through earning respect. When disputes arose, people asked for their input. When decisions needed making about the valley's future, their voices carried weight. It wasn't a role Mara had ever imagined for herself, but it fit somehow. Maybe because she'd never forgotten what it felt like to be powerless, and that made her fight harder for people who still were. The years passed, each one building on the last. The cabin grew more lived in, more loved. The garden expanded. They added chickens, then goats, then a milk cow that Rhett complained about constantly but fed with careful attention. The mountain became less of a fortress and more of a home. And through it all, Mara kept learning that strength wasn't about being fearless. It was about being scared and acting anyway. That worth wasn't determined by someone else's narrow standards, but by your own sense of who you wanted to be. That the most radical thing you could do sometimes was simply refuse to disappear. One evening, 5 years after that first night on the mountain, Mara stood in the same spot where she'd watched the cabin burn. The new cabin stood solid behind her, smoke rising from its chimney, warm light spilling from its windows. Rhett was inside, cooking dinner and probably burning it, but that was okay. Nothing was perfect. Perfect was a trap anyway, a standard nobody could actually meet. This was better than perfect. This was real. She thought about the woman who'd stood on that platform in Red Hollow, bracing for rejection, expecting nothing. That woman was still her, would always be part of her, but she'd been added to, built on, made stronger by every challenge she'd faced and every time she'd chosen to face it instead of run. The unwanted bride, that's what they'd called her. She smiled at the irony. Turned out being unwanted by the wrong people was the best thing that could have happened to her. It had freed her to find the right people, the right place, the right life. Not easy, not comfortable, but hers in every way that mattered. Rhett came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a towel. Dinner's ready, and by ready I mean edible, mostly. Good enough. She walked back toward him, toward home, toward the life they'd built from ashes and stubbornness, and refusing to accept other people's judgment of what they deserved. You look thoughtful, he said as she climbed the steps. Just remembering how it started, how far we've come. He put an arm around her shoulders, pulled her close. Pretty far. Think we're done traveling? Not even close. But I like where we landed. Me too. They went inside together into the warmth and the smell of slightly burned dinner and the sounds of a life being lived fully, without apology. The mountain stood around them, eternal and indifferent, but they'd made a place in it anyway, had carved out space for themselves through sheer determination and the willingness to fight for what they believed they deserved. And in the end, that was the real story. Not about a woman who was unwanted, but about a woman who learned that other people's wanting or not wanting, you had nothing to do with your actual worth. About finding the strength to want yourself, to believe you deserved good things, to fight for them when they were threatened. The unwanted bride had become something else entirely. A survivor. A fighter. A woman who'd stood her ground and won. Not because she was perfect or fearless, or always certain she was doing the right thing, but because she'd decided that running was no longer an option and standing was the only choice left. And that, Mara had learned, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.